Napoleon's journey to Paris from the small provincial town of Fréjus took about a week all told, and on the way his procession stopped by a number of towns and cities, welcomed as heroes by masses of gleeful citizens. At Lyon, the welcome was particularly jubilant. Napoleon's entourage was met with wine, flowers, and even a stage play. The inhabitants at the, quote, pitch of delirium, as Eugene later described. People were struck by just how exotic the officers appeared, now heavily tanned and donning shimmering Mameluke sabres. Arriving in Paris on October 16th, Napoleon quickly made his way to his place at La Rue de la Victoire, keen to reunite with Josephine, who he hadn't seen and barely written to for 16 months. But alas, she was not there, though her reasons for doing so were quite innocent. Josephine's affair with Hippolyte Charles had run its course, though the two would continue to exchange letters. Since her husband's return to Paris had been so abrupt, Josephine was residing in a new home she'd purchased at Malmaison, an idyllic little chateau just outside of Paris, nestled in pristine woodland. For 2 days, the couple did not reunite. Napoleon took visitors at his place on La Victoire until arrangements could be made for Josephine to return from Malmaison. On her way back into town, Napoleon went out to see her, and after some kerfuffle, the couple were reunited. It was not a happy reunion. What followed was a very heated domestic played out on the roadside for all to see. Josephine was clearly caught off guard, and in the ensuing hail of mutual denunciations and expletives, she came away worse for wear. In a huff, she retired to Malmaison, her bags packed. To Bourrienne, Napoleon had confided that he had no intention of forgiving Josephine for her infidelity, though his words were no doubt inspired by a temporary bout of anger. Truth was, Napoleon was well on his way to forgiving Josephine wholeheartedly, though not quite entirely out of the goodness of his heart. He'd avenged her infidelity with infidelity of his own. Whilst in Cairo, Napoleon had engaged in his own torrid affair with a young woman. Pauline Ferret was the wife of an officer of the 22nd Chasseurs. Her hair was luxuriant and blonde, her features round and elegant. In a chance meeting at the Tivoli Gardens on the night of November 30th, sparks flew. He nicknamed Pauline Cleopatra. Her husband, Joseph Ferret, soon discovered the affair and divorced Pauline, after which she was Napoleon's girlfriend for the remainder of the campaign. Though Joseph Ferret advertised his wife's infidelity, with the affair eventually becoming common knowledge in Paris, and thereby reaching Josephine's ear, Andrew Roberts in his biography of Napoleon pithily remarks, quote, "The affair deflected charges of cuckoldry from Napoleon, which for a French general then was a far more serious accusation than adultery. Pauline would hang around in Egypt after Napoleon, warming the beds of Junot and later Kléber. Shrewd investments in Brazilian timber paid dividends, and a very wealthy and independent Pauline felt in no hurry to return to France for several years." To get back on track, the same night on October 18th, with a messy divorce out of the question, Napoleon made his way to Malmaison to make amends. He later recalled, but what could I do? As Josephine came down the staircase in tears, she was followed by Eugene and Hortense, who were sobbing too. I was not given a heart for nothing, and I cannot remain unmoved when tears are flowing. Eugene followed me to Egypt. I look upon him as my adopted son. He is brave, such a good man. Hortense is growing fast. She is spoken of highly by all who know her. I confess I was deeply moved. I couldn't resist the sobs of those children. I asked myself, were they to be the victims of their mother's ill conduct? How could I help it? Every man is weak. Over the next few sleepless hours, the woes of marriage were expiated, their love reaffirmed. Lucien Bonaparte arrived the next day to find Napoleon and Josephine sharing a bed. Though Napoleon's infidelities would continue, indeed they'd never stop, Josephine was too old and too indebted to risk another flight of fancy. She would remain loyal from this day forwards, and prove her worth in the coming weeks. Napoleon's attentions then could finally return to war and politics, and his most immediate concern was making sure that he wasn't straight up arrested. His return from Egypt was not only unsanctioned, but Napoleon had treated quarantines like speed bumps. His enemies in Paris were well aware, and quite a few raised a fuss about Napoleon's apparent desertion. Bernadotte was vocal in this regard. Good relations with Napoleon had soured after their cooperation on the Italian campaign, and Bernadotte's eventual marriage to Napoleon's ex, Désirée Clary. He joined others in the Ministry of War who wanted Napoleon arrested on charges of desertion, but fortunately for Napoleon, his immense popularity all but assured his freedom. Paris ranted and raved for the hero of Egypt, a reputation Napoleon was sure to propel with well-timed and oft-embellished propaganda. Still, he required official sanction, and so at Gustave Monge's suggestion, visited director and current president of the Council of 500, Louis Goyer, in his private residence on the 17th. When the conversation drifted onto Napoleon's desertion, Goyer was understanding, but insisted that Napoleon attend a meeting of the legislature and make his case. So the following day, Napoleon was at the Palais de Luxembourg, where the 500 met. Goyer described what happened next. Bonaparte presented himself before the Directory as we had arranged. He tried to justify his desertion on the grounds of our successive defeats, and the indignation felt when he heard that our frontiers were again endangered by foreign powers. He clearly attributed all our troubles to his absence. "Citizen directors," he declared, "my sword shall never be drawn except in defense of this republic and its government." As president of the Directory, I replied as follows: "Citizen General, the Executive Directory, like all of France, greets your unanticipated return with pleasure, mingled with some surprise. Only your enemies, whom we naturally regard as our own, could cast an unfavourable interpretation on the patriotic motives which induced you to abandon your colours. In fact, the triumphs of your comrades in arms have already saved the Republic, but there are still laurels to be earned in those fields of Italy which saw your memorable exploits." The official ceremony continued, with Napoleon receiving credit for Cairo, Tabor and Aboukir, whilst the whole matter of the army's entrapment was quietly ignored. More than a few politicians were very uneasy with his reappearance, but were unable to challenge Napoleon directly. His popularity made him untouchable. The guards of the Luxembourg lauded Napoleon with cries of "Vive Bonaparte," and Paris was abuzz with word of the hero's return. Friends and allies offered what aid they could. In the days after arriving, Napoleon received numerous visitors and attended a bunch of meetings. For our purposes, the most important meeting was with Maurice Talleyrand, who gave Napoleon the lay of the land. Described in detail were all of the various woes ailing the Directory, and it's worth getting up to speed ourselves. On the political side of things, the Directory was at the absolute rock bottom of its popularity. Corruption, incompetence and lethargy sapped popular appeal so comprehensively that the Directory was basically limping along on inertia. That it had survived so long is remarkable. After the coup of Thermidor that had instituted the Directory way back in 1794, there had been 3 more coups. The first was Gracchus Babeuf's Conspiracy of Equals, a neo-Jacobin plot to reignite the social revolution, in the end thwarted by police. This attack from the left triggered a reactionary turn to the right amongst the Directory. Censorship was reinstated in full, civil liberties impinged, and crypto-royalists resurged in fraud-ridden elections after 1797. The rise of the crypto-royalists imperiled the Republic, triggering in turn the coup of Fructidor, which we've been over in detail. Well, after that, conservative, pro-Republic delegates took the helm, and the 5 directors we're familiar with, Merlin, Rebel, Barras, Neufchâteau and Revellière, were firmly established by 1798. They presided over a period of decline for the Directory, during which the economy took yet another nosedive and rebellions flared in the Vendée and Provence. Things were shaken up when Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a familiar face from our look at the French Revolution, replaced Rebel in May 1799, while Napoleon was still in Egypt. Sieyès, a priest-turned-politician, was a powerful figure, and determined that the failures of the directors warranted a stronger hand in leadership. The result was the coup of Prairial, also known as the Journée Parlementaire. One of Sieyès' allies, Roger Ducos, replaced Revellière. Merlin was replaced by Jean-François Moulin, an ex-Jacobin and a revolutionary general. Neufchâteau was briefly replaced by a guy named Jean-Baptiste Tréliard, who lasted exactly 2 months before the legislature booted him out in favour of Louis Goyer. Such instability in the Directory's executive leadership opened them up to attacks from within, and dozens of plots were afoot long before Napoleon had returned to Paris. Half the reason the plots were viable was due to the terrible health of the economy. The Directory, and more specifically one of the few honest men in government, Minister of Finance Dominique Vincennes Romain Nogaret, inherited a slew of economic problems from the Committee of Public Safety. The 3 big ones were runaway food prices, hyperinflation, and an economic blockade imposed by the Royal Navy. Now in 1799, these issues were still unresolved, all of these problems exacerbating the other. Though the Committee of Public Safety had been on again off again about economic interventionism, the Directory were firmly market liberal and repealed laws fixing food prices. Immediately, prices spiked. Poor harvests in 1797 and 98 compounded the issue, resulting in widespread rioting and a commensurate rise in banditry. Of course, France looked to her friends for trade, since the British blockade was so effective, and here the sister republics, German states on the Rhine, and Spain proved to be lifelines. Trade and diplomatic ties to the fledgling United States, which had been strong until 1793, were placed under immense strain when the Americans refused to acknowledge their debts, claiming that these were owed to the monarchy, not the Republic. In the ensuing quasi-war, French and American vessels clashed, and another market was closed to France. Inflation continued to strangle the domestic economy. In a vain attempt to lower inflation, Nogaret repudiated fully 2/3 of the state's debt. Since the French paper currency, the assignat, was unsalvageable, the remaining consolidated third was used to buck up a new currency, the mandats territoriaux, but it ended up proving equally as worthless. The need for money remained urgent. In desperation, the Directory implemented a range of unpopular taxes and centralized them in the hands of trusted agents, moves that alienated their main base of support from among bourgeois men of property. Taxing their windowsills, the frontages of their homes, and imposing harsh tariffs sapped support rapidly. So too was land confiscated, outrageous fines imposed, and hostages held for ransom. Some pressure was relieved by Napoleon's Treaty of Campo Formio, and not a moment too soon. We've seen how cash-strapped the Directory was during the campaign, how insistent they were for loot. Well, the reason was that Lazare Carnot's vaunted levée en masse, which had worked miracles in 1794 and 95, had run out of steam by 1798. This not only forced the Directory to, as we saw, rely heavily upon price-gouging private contractors, but also to shrink the size of the army. The French army of 750,000 in mid-1794 was down to 350,000 in 1796, and barely 200,000 by 1798. Then Minister of War, our old friend from Italy, Jean-Baptiste Jourdan, had implemented universal conscription with the so-called Jourdan Law. Draconian enforcement in such a time of hardship further inflamed France. Throughout all of this, the Directory was seen to be doing very little to help. Not only were all of the politicians corrupt and largely insulated from inflation, but the whole system, from the legislature to the constitution to local department administrators, was so dysfunctional that few could see light at the end of the tunnel. But none of these economic woes touch on the conduct of the war. The Directory had bungled their diplomatic plays so badly that despite mutual acrimony and suspicion, Austria, Russia and Britain buried their disputes to form a second coalition to contain France. It was far from a foregone conclusion that the next war between France and Austria would be a full-blown continent-wide affair. Though Campo Formio was never fully accepted by the Austrians, and they'd always planned to retake their lost lands, to go back to war only a year and a bit later was largely the work of French diplomatic provocations. French pressure on the Rhineland German states to assert their independence from Vienna resulted in the formation of a Rhinish League. Then in March 1798, unwitting pawns in great power politics, the Swiss cantons, were unwillingly admitted to the French sphere. The revolutionaries in Bern agitated against the cantons, while the Cisalpine Republic launched an ill-advised attempt to take a slice of southern Switzerland. France soon intervened, overrunning the Swiss rapidly and installing their allies in Bern. The Helvetic Republic was proclaimed, with France annexing Geneva and Basel in the trade. Supply lines to Italy secured, France completed their conquest of the peninsula, save for Sicily and Sardinia. The assassination of French general Léonard Dupont in December 1797 was used as pretext for Berthier to invade Rome and form the Roman Republic in February 1798. Tuscany and Sardinia-Piedmont, which had survived all this tumult, were then subsumed. A French-sponsored revolution overthrew King Victor Amadeus, forcing him to flee to Sardinia, and making room for the creation of the Piedmontese Republic. Tuscany, meanwhile, was invaded on exaggerated claims of provocation and occupied by France. Around mid-1798, and Napoleon departed on his Oriental expedition. Malta and Egypt were added to the long list of French conquests, pissing off both the Russians and the Turks, and ending any chance of a rapprochement with the British. Capitalizing, the Austrian Foreign Minister, Johann von Tilgut, worked behind the scenes to build up the second coalition of Austria, Russia, Britain and Naples. Their old partner Prussia refused to join. Prussia and Austria were again at each other's throats over possession of Bavaria, bifurcating the imperial camp. Bavaria was promised to the Austrians by the secret clauses of Campo Formio, but that did not mean the French weren't willing to leak the details to their diplomatic advantage. In a response, in April 1799, rogue Austrian cavalry intercepted a French delegation returning from Rastatt. A scuffle ensued in which two of the diplomats were killed and a third gravely wounded. Hostilities between both the French Republic and the Austrian Archduchy were intense. Swords would be used to close the matter. When war was declared in November 1798 on France and her ally Spain, the French weren't caught completely unprepared, but they could not have expected just how ferocious the coalition's offensive could have been. The main object was to oust the French from Italy, so Naples invaded from the south, supported by Horatio Nelson. Rome was temporarily seized until a spirited counterattack by Jean-Étienne Championnet drove them back into Naples proper. The short-lived Parthenopaean Republic was then declared, lasting 5 months until the Neapolitans regrouped. Meanwhile, up north, a joint Austro-Russian attack tore through northern Italy in early 1799. The elderly but supremely talented General Alexander Suvorov, Count of Rymnik, joined Austrian Feldzeugmeister Paul Kray. Together with a combined force around 200,000, they defeated the armies of Bartolomé Scherer and Victor Moreau in a lightning campaign. Despite fierce resistance from Dąbrowski's Polish Legion and the Cisalpine army, Milan was retaken by late April, bringing an end to the Cisalpine Republic. Turin was returned to the exiled Sardinian monarchy a few weeks later. The defensive efforts of Scherer and Moreau had been hampered from day one by the Directory's mismanagement. They insisted that Jacques MacDonald receive the lion's share of reinforcements, but after the fall of the Cisalpine Republic, the error of this overcommitment was revealed when MacDonald's entire force was ensnared in Campania. Suvorov's advance compelled him to retreat along the western coast, all the way back to the Ligurian Republic. Though Genoa held, it was small consolation. All of Napoleon's gains of 1796 and 97 were undone within just a few weeks. Things went no better in Germany. Jean-Baptiste Jourdan returned to the field and launched an abortive offensive into the Schwarzwald, only to be slammed by Archduke Charles, returned to form. Battered all the way back to the Rhine, Jourdan earned the unfortunate nickname the Anvil, since he was beaten so regularly. André Massena, in command of the Army of Observation stationed in Switzerland, was then beset by a vengeful Charles. Though he fought well, Massena was still forced to yield at Zurich in May and then fall back on stronger defences. It was this uninterrupted string of grave defeats that compelled Sieyès to launch his little coup back in Pryrel. With new blood injected into the Directory, reforms were implemented and a series of counterattacks launched. By mid-1799, entropy was setting into the coalition camp. Austria was desperate for Britain to take on a more proactive role in the fighting, while Britain harangued the Austrians over outstanding debts. Where Suvorov wished to pivot towards attacking a vulnerable Massena in Switzerland, Foreign Minister Turgut refused to countenance the plan, forcing the Russians to send General Korsakov up unsupported. In August, the French made an attempt to break out into northern Italy. Bartolomé Joubert, who had won Napoleon's esteem, was ordered by Sieyès to replace Moreau as commander of the Army of Italy. Joubert advanced as far as Novi before being engaged by Suvorov and Melas. The fighting was extremely fierce. The French gave as good as they got, and around 10,000 lay dead on either side by battle's end. But defeat was assured when, fairly early on in the fighting, Joubert was shot dead leading his men in a counterattack. News of Novi and Joubert's death sent shivers through France. To make matters worse, in August, a joint Anglo-Russian landing in Calanzug threatened to overrun General Guillaume Brun, stationed in the Batavian Republic. Though Brun was pushed inland and heavily outnumbered, the Duke of York's sluggish landing and poor cooperation between Russians and Brits would result in Brun beating both at the Battle of Bergen in September. September, all round, proved to be a month of deliverance for France. Massena counterattacked and isolated Korsakov at Zurich on the 26th, bloodying the Russians before Suvorov could intervene. Cohesion among the coalition powers collapsed as an irate Tsar Paul ordered his armies home, and the Brits began evacuating Holland. On October 18th, York and the scattered survivors of the invasion force were boarding boats headed for England. Of course, as Napoleon and Talleyrand shared breakfast, they weren't yet aware that the Netherlands was safe once more. But the general sense that France's position had stabilised was impossible to miss. For Napoleon, immediately taking to the field and winning some battles would not yield quite the same glory as it would have just a few months ago. So he listened intently as Talleyrand laid out the scale of discontent with the Directory, tacitly inviting Napoleon into a conspiracy. Talleyrand's reasons for recruiting Napoleon were naturally deeply cynical. He had been fired as foreign minister way back in June for defrauding the Americans, heightening tensions in the ongoing quasi-war. Napoleon wasn't fussed about the corruption, and forgave Talleyrand for not squaring things away with the Ottomans as was promised. No specific details of the Brumaire plot were shared, in all likelihood, but Napoleon was introduced over the next few days to several of its key plotters. The first to visit Napoleon was Pierre Roederer, who we briefly saw make an appearance during the August insurrection way back in 1792. Pierre's knack was for the well-timed escape. He knew just the right time to lay low and survive from the Estates General all the way up to the days of the Directory. Roederer put Napoleon in contact with a bunch of fellow conspirators, such as Hugh Bernard Marat, Pierre-François Réal, Admiral Eustache Broix, and Antoine Boulet. Bit by bit, Napoleon pieced together the scope and aims of the coup, even if much of it remained shrouded in mystery. His brother, Lucien, elected to the Council of 500, was in on the plot and likely invited his brother too. But it was not altogether clear if Napoleon was truly welcome. The Brumaire coup was the brainchild of Sieyès, who again planned another coup to oust his opponents and solidify control. The ulterior aim was to do away with the ineffectual Constitution of Year 3, a document which had proven difficult to change, but impossible to ignore. Few politicians placed much stock in the Directory, but quite a few, especially in the Council of 500, were neo-Jacobins who staunchly defended the Constitution, so overcoming them would be quite a bit more involved than a mere parliamentary coup as back in May and June. Specifically, it required quite a few politicians, bureaucrats, and policemen. Joseph Fouché was all three. Infamous for his terrible conduct during the Terror, Fouché was by now well established as the Minister of Police. Intelligence was one thing, brawn was another, and a reliable man was still needed to be the muscle for the operation. And that's where Napoleon came in. He was to be Sieyès' sword. Napoleon was not Sieyès' first pick. Joubert was the prime candidate, but of course could do little from beyond the grave. Scherer would have been nice to have before being discredited in Italy. Jourdan, abiding by his republican scruples, refused to help. So Napoleon it was, but other factors recommended him. Not merely popular, Napoleon was seen as a peacemaker and a man of laws and letters, someone not tainted in the least with the bureaucratic lethargy of the Directory. So too was he famed for framing the constitutions of Italy and advancing science in cooperation with the Institut de France and founding the Institut d'Egypte. Still, it was as a last resort that Sieyès turned to Napoleon. Talleyrand would act as the go-between as the two men despised each other. Sieyès had initially joined Bernadotte in insisting Napoleon be executed for desertion. Even after talking things over with Talleyrand and Lucien, and meeting with several plotters, Napoleon was still non-committal. For a man famed for his prodigious output of letters and memos, Napoleon was suspiciously muted in the weeks leading up to Brumaire, suggesting that he was erring towards the side of the plotters. Still, he bided his time. Possibly, this was to entice Sieyès to pick him over other alternatives. At a performance at the Théâtre de Célestin, Napoleon was acclaimed by the baying crowds, and with performative embarrassment, agreed to sit at the front of the theatre. Such displays were combined with a media blitz, helped along by ally Michel Reynaud, who had returned from his brief governorship in Malta. Sieyès and Napoleon met for the first time on the afternoon of October 23rd, at a meeting organised by Roederer. No agreement was reached, but Napoleon did remark to a colleague that, like a pear, he had to wait until this fruit was ripe. But his position was still fairly perilous. He had enemies aplenty. Purely by chance, Napoleon ran into Bernadotte at the Théâtre Français on the night of the 23rd. To Bourrienne, Napoleon described their meeting. "Well, I bet you can't guess whom I've just breakfasted with, eh? With Bernadotte, and the joke is that I invited myself. I ran into Bernadotte as we were leaving, and upon my word, not knowing what on earth to say, in the spur of the moment I asked him if he would join our party this morning. He replied that he would, and as we were then near his house on the Rue de Cisalpine, I plain asked him for a cup of coffee and said I'd be delighted to talk with him. He made himself quite pleasant to me. What to make of it, Bourrienne? If I'm right, our meeting will compromise him with Goyer. Remember one thing, always take the first step towards your enemies, otherwise they'll think you're afraid." Napoleon's improvisational streak and natural political instincts are on full display here, if Bourrienne is to be taken at his word. It took 3 more days for Napoleon to pick a side. At a breakfast hosted at La Victoire, Napoleon opined on the dismal state of the Directory to a fellow general, Paul Thiébaut. In bold airs, he declaimed the torpidity and ineptitude of the Directory, opining that, quote, "These men are bringing France down to the level of their own blundering, degrading the nation, and she is beginning to repudiate them." The woes of France could be pinned, in Napoleon's now firm opinion, on the lawyers and jurists of the Directory. In his mind, France could be revitalised if power was given over to men of drive and purpose, men like him. In closing with Thiébaut, Napoleon said, quote, "Well, what can generals expect from this government of lawyers?" The next day, October 27th, Napoleon met with Pierre Roederer and committed to the coup. By now the coup was well matured. The alienated middle class was bankrolling the plot, and conspirators could be found at every stratum of government. It'd only be a few more days until the plan could be launched, yet there was still much to do, and Napoleon played his part ably. As a general, he brought with him the support of the rank-and-file soldiers, as well as many capable officers. Others who weren't sold on Brumaire were sold on Napoleon, and agreed either to help or stay out of the way. Exactly what happened when and how remains a mystery. The plotters were very good at covering their tracks. Still, the Directory had their spies, and knew that something was up. Napoleon was rightly suspected as being a key plotter, and the Directory went to great pains to placate him. He was offered a selection of plum assignments to the armies at the front, but just to show how absolutely committed Napoleon now was, he refused, citing poor health. A few weeks ago, and such an offer would have likely turned his head. Since the carrot hadn't worked, the Directory whipped out the stick. Lies were spread through the press about Napoleon's financial windfall when in Italy. Though he'd certainly returned to France a wealthy man, Napoleon made his fortune fairly honestly, mostly with back pay and then less than honestly with a smattering of graft. But compared to the antics of Junot, Augereau, and Marat, who could fill several carts with loot, Napoleon's own enrichment seems quaint. Director Paul Barras, a slippery Napoleonic ally turned enemy, invited Napoleon to dine with him at the Palais de Luxembourg. At this dinner, much was discussed, little of it important, as the two men danced around the real questions at hand. If Barras' intention was to poach Napoleon for the Directory, then he failed spectacularly in his aims. Offending Napoleon on 2 counts, Barras hinted that the general ought to take up a combat posting. So too should the presidency be palmed off to General Gabriel de Edeville, recently returned from a disgraceful performance in Haiti. Later on, Napoleon claimed that as a result of this dinner, that he took the side of the Brumaire plotters, though in all likelihood he had decided days earlier. Supposedly, Napoleon met Sieyès later that night to affirm his support. Whether or not this is true, Barras knew he'd cocked up and by next morning tried to take a breakfast with Napoleon and make the Directory's case. For certain, Napoleon met Sieyès at Lucien's place on the night of November 1st. Acrimony was suspended as the full scope of the plot was revealed to Napoleon by the mastermind himself. Like the rest of the conspirators, Napoleon was heartened to learn of Fouché's involvement. He had spies and agents everywhere. The coup was scheduled for 16 Brumaire, or the 7th of November, and would come in 2 stages. For the first stage, there'd be a special assembly of the Council of Ancients at the Théâtre des Tuileries. Delegates in on the plot would force through a motion calling for an extraordinary meeting of the Ancients and their counterparts in the Council of 500. But instead of holding this meeting at the Palais de Luxembourg or even the Tuileries, a third venue was chosen, the Château de Saint-Cloud. 7 miles west of Paris, the expansive grounds of the chateau were just far enough away from the city to make sure that the coup could go off without any armed intervention from the sections. It also made sure that if push came to shove and knives were drawn, the bloodshed would be contained. To secure the safety of the coup, Sieyès and Lucien would induce the councils to elect Napoleon to command of the Paris garrison, the 17th military district. Sieyès focused on the ancients, while Lucien, replacing Goyer as president, would wrangle the 500. Then, Sieyès and Decaux would resign as directors, placing pressure on Goyer, Barras and Moulin to follow suit. The next day, on 17 Brumaire, November 8th, Napoleon would march into Saint-Cloud and compel the councils to abolish the Directory and the Constitution. A 3-man executive, of Sieyès, Decaux and Napoleon, would then assume control and frame a new constitution. Of course, the coup of Brumaire would not turn out so neat as the step-by-step of the plan, and that's where Napoleon was key. As the muscle, if things went wrong, or the councils refused to play ball, he was expected to use the threat of violence to keep the coup running smoothly. For the time being, Napoleon carried on with fairly normal, banal, day-to-day activities. Though his name was the first on Paris's lips, he attended very few gatherings. But Napoleon couldn't miss a banquet held in his honour on November 6th, hosted at l'Église des Saint-Sulpice. Over 700 attendees feted the general, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. When the time came for Napoleon to give a speech, he appealed to the unity of France and the Republic, declaring, quote, "To subvert a representative form of government is a criminal act in this century of enlightenment and liberty. I raise my glass to the union of all Frenchmen." Irony oozes from this proclamation. Just as Napoleon professed loyalty to the Directory, he plotted their overthrow. Of course, everything was meant to kick off tomorrow, on the 7th, but the events of the banquet, combined with the general angst, broke the resolve of several key plotters among the Council of Ancients. It was a critical failure, and the whole plot threatened to disintegrate. In the delay of 2 days, until November 9th, Napoleon worked tirelessly to keep the plot together. In this gap, he met with fellow generals Bernadotte, Moreau and Jourdan. Swapping out the wine for after-dinner brandy and cognac, the conversation turned political. Moreau was quickly moved to Napoleon's side. There was no hope of swaying Bernadotte, who was convinced that Napoleon would be guillotined before long. Napoleon did try the moves on with Jourdan. He asked, point blank, his opinion on the state of the Republic. Jourdan replied that he believed stability was paramount. At this, Napoleon invited Jourdan to the plot, an act done, quote, in the interest of the Republic. Sticking to his guns, though, Jourdan refused, but did agree not to interfere. During another day of fevered preparations on the 8th, Napoleon dined with an old comrade from Italy, Ora Sebastiani. These last-minute negotiations secured Sebastiani's support, along with a regiment of dragoons. Later that night, Napoleon dined with former director Cambacérès. The plot was discussed, and to quell frazzled nerves, Napoleon reassured his colleagues that, quote, when it comes to conspiracy, everything is permissible. For whatever doubts Napoleon must surely have harboured about tomorrow's coup, he kept them well concealed. The night before, Napoleon and company were merry, singing a favourite revolutionary ditty, Le Pont Neuf. On the morning of November 9th, the coup d'état of Brumaire began. 60 officers of the Army and National Guard gathered at La Victoire. Here Napoleon greeted them in civilian clothing, demanding oaths of loyalty to himself and the councils. Over at the Tuileries, Napoleon's appointment as commander of the garrison was confirmed by a rump session of the Council of Ancients. Sieyès and his allies came out in force, also managing to pass the decree to reconvene both the councils at Saint-Cloud. So far so good. The change was to take place next morning, and at such short notice, Sieyès advantageously forgot to inform a number of opposition delegates. By mid-morning, word had reached Napoleon that he was promoted. As per the plan, he shed his civvies, donned his general's uniform, and with his cohort of officers rendezvoused with Sebastiani and his dragoons at the Tuileries. There Napoleon committed himself and the officers to the defence of the Republic. Doubts as to Napoleon's sincerity were quashed when he appointed the trustworthy General François-Joseph Lefebvre as his 2IC. The walls were now closing in on Goyer, Barras and Moulins, but since no shots had been fired, no deadlines passed, the existence of a coup was in doubt. They didn't even realise they were in a trap, and by the time they did, it'd be all too late. Of course, Goyer was suspicious, but unconvinced that anything was truly amiss. That morning, he'd signed the order relocating to Saint-Cloud completely unaware that by doing so he ensured his own downfall. In meeting with the new Minister of War, Edmond Dubois-Croncet, Goyer was told outright that a coup was in action. Naturally then, he went to his Minister of Police to see if these rumours could be substantiated. Joseph Fouché reported nothing amiss, and if Minister of Police Joseph Fouché, his ear to the ground, his spies everywhere, said that there was no news, there was no news. Still, Goyer was a cautious creature and conjured a clever little plan to see if there really was a coup. He sent an invitation out to Napoleon to dine with him on the night of the 9th. It was a shrewd little trap. If Napoleon refused, Goyer could be sure he was in on the plot, but if he accepted, Napoleon would be at Goyer's mercy. Sensing the dilemma, Napoleon made an argued move of his own. Awake at 4 AM on the 10th, he sent Eugène de Goyer directly to reschedule the dinner to that evening, but in the meantime they could have breakfast. Goyer was invited to La Victoire to dine with Napoleon and Josephine. The idea was to reassure Goyer, but almost literally flip the table on him by inviting him to Napoleon's place, and thereby putting Goyer at Napoleon's mercy. Once Eugene arrived, Goyer saw through the trap. Sending his wife in his stead, he raced around the Luxembourg at 8 AM, just as Napoleon was on his way to Saint-Cloud. As he passed the Place de la Concorde, where Louis XVI, Robespierre and Danton had been guillotined, Napoleon turned to a friend and remarked, quote, "Tomorrow we shall either sleep at the Luxembourg or end up here." On the road, he bumped into an agitated Barras. It was clear it had been a sleepless night, and as further proof of just how blindsided the directors were, Barras asked Napoleon to talk that evening to clear the air. There would be no such reconciliation. Moreau arrived mid-morning at the head of a column of grenadiers. The National Guard who defended the Luxembourg did not so much as spit in protest. In fact, to shouts of Vive Bonaparte, they sided with the coup. Barras, Goyer and Moulins were quickly arrested. Though they weren't at bayonet point, the threat was clear. It was demanded of each director that they join Sieyès and Ducos and resign. Barras broke almost immediately on assurances from Talleyrand and Bruix. His immense fortune would remain untouched in exchange for a quiet removal. Under house arrest, Moulins held out, as did Goyer, for another day. With the councils now fully assembled at Saint-Cloud, Napoleon entered the chateau, grenadiers at his back. Meeting with the Council of Ancients first, he addressed them at around 2 p.m. Citoyens repositants, the present circumstances are extraordinary. You sit atop a volcano. Yesterday you imbued me with the power to carry out your decree, transferring this legislature to Saint-Cloud. I immediately called for my comrades in arms and raced to your aid. Well, today I am already overwhelmed by calumny. Caesar, Cromwell, a military government are spoken of, as though the past could be compared to the present. But gentlemen, had I aimed at a dictatorship, would I have lent support to you national representatives? The Republic is without a government. The Council of 500 is divided against itself. The Directory dissolved. There remains only this Council of Ancients. It is from this council that I derive my authority. It now remains for you to take action. So speak, I will carry out your orders. Let us preserve liberty, let us save equality. Murmurs from among the delegates unnerved Napoleon, so he turned to his grenadiers and asked them whether or not they thought their general to be deceitful. Quote, I promised you victory. Was it for my interests or those of the Republic? The soldiers cheered loudly, but still the ancients sat in silence, until one among them rose. He asked Napoleon to swear fealty to the Constitution of Year 3. For a moment all was silent. It appeared Napoleon had been outplayed. That was until he spoke. The Constitution? What Constitution? You yourselves have torn it up. You broke it on the 18th of Fructidor. You broke it on the 22nd of Floreal. You broke it on the 30th of Prairial. Not a soul respects it any longer. I will speak out. Since my return, I have been surrounded by intrigues. Every faction has approached me. Men who arrogantly describe themselves as the only patriots have urged me to destroy the Constitution. What he was saying was that trust in the Constitution was non-existent. It was now just a piece of paper. Point made, Napoleon departed, moving deeper into the chateau's orangerie, where the Council of 500 had gathered. Where the ancients had been quite reserved and quiescent, happy to let Napoleon say his piece, the 500 were different beasts entirely. Since the beginning of their session at midday, they had been whipped into a ladder by a resurgent opposition. Several opposition delegates called for an immediate oath to the Constitution before debates could commence, and despite support from co-conspirators such as Boulier, Lucien found these demands impossible to ignore. So like his brother the night before, Lucien swore an oath to the Constitution he was about to violate. Guards and soldiers had steadily surrounded the orangerie, much to the annoyance of the opposition, who decried the presence of armed men before a democratic assembly. From one of the doorways Napoleon entered, his presence immediately setting off the opposition. As he made his way to the podium at the centre of the hall, Napoleon was jostled and heckled mercilessly. Shouts of Cromwell, Caesar, and Tyrant echoed throughout the hall. At the podium, Napoleon tried to speak but could barely get a word in. Evidently, this rough reception unnerved him. He fumbled the first few lines of a speech before being yelled down. But as the clamour continued, Napoleon too was roused to anger. He railed against the, quote, intriguers and hypocrites of the council, as delegates pinned him to the podium. In futility, Lucien hammered away with his gavel, trying to restore order. At this point, Lefebvre had no idea exactly what was going on, but thought from all the noise that his general must have been in danger. As we'll get to, Napoleon would go on to claim that at this stage knives were drawn, but such claims were only reflexive attempts to justify what happened next. Taking 4 grenadiers, big blokes over 6 foot tall and capped in bearskins, Lefebvre cleared a path. He found Napoleon red-cheeked, his collar torn having been attacked by some particularly outraged delegates. Grenadier Tomé put himself between Napoleon and the delegates as he shuffled the general to safety, a signal service not soon forgotten. Outside, Napoleon made haste to the palace pavilion where he met Talleyrand and Roederer, as well as a few other conspirators. They now awaited Lucien, who remained behind, and Sieyès, who had come to the orangerie to defend Napoleon. Both were accosted relentlessly. Just as the opposition began a vote to declare Napoleon an outlaw, Lucien quit the scene while Sieyès stayed behind. He found his brother pacing around the pavilion apartment, pondering what to do next. Every minute that slipped away was time in which the opposition could rally, or a friendly general, like Jourdan or Bernadotte, could secure the loyalty of the troops. The coup had reached its most critical moment, and it was into this breach that the military men stepped. As the politicians took flight, fleeing in carriages, gold sewn into their cloaks, General Pierre Augereau announced himself. At first he was non-committal, reminding Napoleon that he was knee-deep in shit. To this Napoleon replied, Quote, "The wine is poured. We must now drink it, Augereau. Things were worse at Arcole, were they not?" Napoleon's plan now was to win over Captain Jean-Marie Poncet, the commander of the Corps Législatif that guarded Saint-Cloud. The Bonaparte brothers went to Poncet. Lucien took the lead. He claimed that the Council of 500 had devolved into chaos, that a handful of radicals had derailed the session, and intervention was required. To dispel claims that this was a power grab by Napoleon, Lucien drew his sword, pinned it to his brother's chest, and declared that he would rather run him through should he, quote, "attempt anything against the liberty of France." For an impressionable Poncet, it was enough. Napoleon ordered him to regroup with the troops already at hand, and then to disperse the council. Marat, Bessières, Leclerc, Dujardin, Marmont, and Lefebvre led a phalanx of guardsmen and grenadiers into the orangerie. A few delegates had a backbone and in vain beseeched their fellows to stand firm. Others, shedding their senatorial togas, leapt to safety from the windows. A rump of the 500 remained, enough for Lucien to form a quorum of about 50. And it was this quorum that spent the next few hours rubber-stamping a slew of decrees. The constitution of Year 3 was annulled, to be replaced by another written by selected members of both councils. The Directory was dissolved, and in its place a provisional government formed. Evoking the ancient Roman Republic, its executive would be a triumvirate of Sieyès, Ducos, and Napoleon, each serving as consuls. Their purpose served, Napoleon then had the 500 and the ancients go into a 4-month recess, from which they'd never return. Word of the coup grew wings, reaching Paris before nightfall. Though they'd prepared for the sections to rise in defence of the Directory, no such uprising occurred. It was further proof that the backbone of the urban revolution, the sans-culottes, had been broken by the whiff of grape shot at Vendémiaire. No, Paris accepted the coup of Brumaire as a fait accompli. The rest of France followed suit. There was some localised resistance in the south and around Calais, but these disquieted officials were quickly shuffled on. With the army on side and the legislature suborned, the consulate was established on firm ground. The coup of Brumaire was over. No blood had been shed, no shots had been fired. Though Sieyès had made Brumaire a reality, it was Napoleon who had seen it through to the end. His popularity and confidence in the lead-up, as well as quick thinking on the second day during a moment of crisis, had clinched the win. That it had taken force to overthrow the councils has been described as a coup within a coup, with military force as exemplified in the person of Napoleon, undergirding the new consulate. This is true, if simplistic. For Napoleon, the point wasn't to get military men into government, so much as to get the incompetent ones out. His opinion, and that generally shared among the political class of France, was that a just, liberal middle ground had been re-established. The radicalism of the Neo-Jacobins in the Council of 500 repudiated, the ossified old guard in the Council of Ancients eschewed. Stability and competency were the promises of Brumaire. There was not much to mourn in the loss of the Directory. It had never been a well-liked or well-oiled machine. After the coup of Thermidor, which created the Directory, and the promulgation of the conservative constitution of Year 3, power in France had been confined to the middle and upper classes. Voting rights were confined to narrow bands of a propertied nouveau riche who'd found prosperity in the revolutionary years. Being generous, the idea was that such a system removed populism and the outsized influence of the sans-culottes from national politics. But it had come at the cost of many of the revolutionary principles that had made a republic and democracy possible in the first place. Therefore, it's not quite fair to say that the consulate, Napoleon in particular, smothered liberty in France, a viewpoint at the time championed by British propaganda. What was dead was the pretense of a representative democracy that had been on life support since 1794. There is no doubt, though, that the emergence of the consulate represented an authoritarian shift in French politics. Little did anyone know, but the political framework of the French Empire had just been laid down. A weaker-than-before legislature was now bound to an empowered executive. And undergirding that executive power was military power. In the moment of crisis, as the 500 threatened to assert their authority, Napoleon, a general, had intervened. This imagery was powerful then and endures even to this day. There's a reason Karl Marx invoked this event for his famous 18 Brumaire of Louis Napoleon in 1852. In Napoleon was an ideal confluence of credits, a proven military record, revolutionary credentials, a reformist streak, and broad popularity. Though it had taken all sorts of civilians and politicians to organise the coup, the military had seen it through. In that sense then, Brumaire was a military-backed political coup. and their rewards for supporting the incoming government would ensure the military assumed a political dimension going forward. In the short term, though, it was necessary to justify Brumaire, and here again Napoleon proved essential. As the most popular conspirator by far, he almost by default became the spokesperson for the incoming consulate. On the night of November 10th, he delivered l'Adresse aux Parisiens, a falsified retelling of events written by Roederer. On my return to Paris, I found the government divided, and all men could agree that the half-ruined constitution could no longer defend liberty. All parties came to me, told me their plans, revealed their secrets, and asked for my support. I refused to be the tool of any party. The Council of Ancients summoned me. I thought it my duty to my fellow citizens, to the soldiers who were dying with their armies, to the glory purchased with their blood, to accept this command. The councils met in Saint-Cloud. My soldiers maintained order. But inside, a gang of assassins established terror. Several deputies of the Council of 500, armed with daggers and firearms, uttered threats of death. I appealed to the Council of Ancients, calling on it to ensure the execution of beneficent decrees. I then entered the Council of 500, alone, my head uncovered. Daggers are at once raised above me. 20 assassins fly at me and strike. The grenadiers of the Corps Legislatif rushed in to interpose themselves between the assassins and me. At the same moment, cries of outlaw are raised against me, the protector of law. President Bonaparte was then threatened. I gave orders to save him from their rage, and 6 grenadiers rescue him. Immediately after this, the grenadiers clear the hall. Alarmed, the factions disperse. People of France, you will doubtless recognize in my conduct the zeal of a defender of liberty, of a citizen devoted to the Republic. Of course, this embellished, contorted, and self-serving propaganda was complete bullshit. That was hardly the point. All it had to do was make Brumaire palatable. The coup was not a coup, it was a necessary defense of liberty. The 500 were not delegates, but assassins, daggers in hand. The constitution was not violated, it was already dead. The new one would be stronger, better. To capstone this farce, Grenadier Thomé was presented with an annuity of 600 francs and a diamond ring presented by Josephine personally. Others who had performed well, like Bessières, Lefebvre, and Pierre Berneville, were given engraved pistols as a mark of esteem and promoted to higher station. With the nation clearly not mourning their departure, Goyer and Moulin resigned. Both would be reconciled to Napoleon, as was his tendency with old enemies. In the days and weeks following Brumaire, the consulate would have to earn its keep. Though Russia and Britain were disengaged from the Second Coalition, France was still tangoing with the resurgent Austria. Italy was to be their prize, a region the French viewed as a natural extension of their sphere of influence, that the Austrians were happy to have a slice of, but mostly wanted divided into a patchwork of states to maintain the European balance of power. The fate of Italy, and Europe more generally, rested on yet another of Napoleon's daring offensive campaigns. The die would be cast on the fields of Marengo.